Welcome to the Mindblowers Podcast, this time with Lars Tvede, who is just back from China. We're going to talk about the burning question around the rare earth materials. Why are the Chinese doing this? Do they want a trade war, or is it just kind of a gambit? What do you think?
Nobody wants a trade war. What they want is the best possible condition in the negotiations they have with the US. So for overall, from the perspective of the US government, so far it's been going exactly as they wanted. Before they started negotiating these tariffs, if you listen to Scott Bessent and Howard Ludwig, you got clear indication that they wanted to collect about $300 to $600 billion a year on tariffs. And then I did my math and figured out that that's probably around 15% average, real tariffs. And so they wanted to reach that, and have done that with a whole lot of nations. And then they wanted to save China to the last, as the last one. And the reason they wanted to save China is it's by far the biggest issue from the American perspective. But it's also by far the biggest trade partner and most difficult. Well, it's not the biggest trade partner, but it's the most difficult negotiation. So far, so good. However, it's getting a little bit rough, and China wants to make it rough for America in these negotiations. Of course, that's a completely typical situation when two sort of equal partners are negotiating, that they both, up the ante before you reach the final agreement. So they're harassing each other right now, but I think we will get an agreement.
When I looked at it, it was like this came as a surprise to the US. There had been quiet for a while around trade, and she was going to meet with Donald Trump in Korea, and suddenly this happens. Do you think it came out of the blue, or did the Americans expect this?
I don't think the Americans expected this. There have been some things from America that the Chinese can experience as provocations, but it was a very, very hard blow back. And then, of course, Donald Trump did what Donald Trump does, and he said, okay, we're going to slash another 100% tariffs on top of the ones you already got. And both of them have a lot of different ways to harass each other. So what is happening in such a situation is typically that before the two leaders meet, in this case on October 29th in Korea, South Korea, you have ongoing negotiations between two teams. And on the day they meet, we'll probably have pretty much everything ironed out. Perhaps a couple of sticking points where it's up to a direct discussion between Xi and Trump. But most likely they will come out and announce a trade agreement, and everybody will be relieved. But I think the trade agreement will be more friendly to China than many people expect. I think there's something else that we need to consider here. So I've been very interested in game theory, and there's a phenomenon called countervailing coalition formation. And that's what you get, for instance, if you have an employer who normally negotiate with one employee at a time for salary, for instance, but where the employer is so rough that they get upset and start talking about it, then the employees might form a union. And then certainly you have one powerful entity against another powerful entity. And in some cases, the union can go on strike, and then certainly the employer is the weak part. So there is a risk for China also in these conditions that by restricting the sales of rare earths globally, that a number of different economic entities like US and the EU and Australia and Canada and so on join forces and go to China collectively and say, if you do this, we will all impose, say, 100% tariff. And so, of course, in such a situation, China can back down, but it could also lead to that once they have formed this coalition and for the first time negotiated this with China collectively, that they then say, okay, if you remove it, we cut it from 100% to 50% or whatever. So it is risky if you play too hard in negotiations.
I kind of caught the message that Trump wanted to add this 100% tariff. But then on the next day, he said, everything will be fine with China. China just kind of had a bad day, or she had a bad day. I guess that's kind of a slightly arrogant message, I suppose. But do you have an idea? I mean, were they talking on other channels during that time between the two messages, or what do you think happened there?
Well, they've been talking all the time. It's two extremely competent teams that are talking at the highest level. And then, of course, you have on both sides an army of people supporting with information and estimations and so on. And also looking at legal implementation. I think that Donald Trump, he saw the stock market went down, and he didn't want another big stock market rout, so he wanted to calm the waters. But Donald Trump uses something that can be called strategic ambiguity. You never know where you have him. Some people think that it's because he's a very confused person. I think it's just a negotiation tactic, which is very efficient many times. By really rattling the rare earth tool, that China has actually made an impression on the US is that it can become very expensive for the US if they don't have a deal. And of course, the US says, okay, but it can also become extremely expensive for you.
Yeah, so maybe let's talk a little bit about these rare earth materials and rare earth metals. So as far as I can tell, the BRIC countries sit on around 70% of the actual metals and materials. But when it comes to the refining of it, China actually sits on about 90%. Do you think that's a sustainable situation for the West? Or do you think this will continue to be used as a pressure point?
No, I think that no matter how these negotiations end, the West will, for the next 5 to 10 years, have a very focused program to get independent on outsiders for these materials. There's, in spite of their name, they're not rare. There are lots of them, many places. What is rare right now is facilities to process them. And China has just built up this almost monopoly on that over the years. And they've done that by being willing to sustain the fairly polluting processes that are necessary. And also when somebody in the West set up new companies to do this, they would dump whatever materials it was, so that the Western companies had to shut down. So you'll have the market, I think, will from now on be divided into two. A Western market which is subsidized by the governments, and so they will give price guarantees, and in some cases take equity stakes in these companies, and also intervene in the bureaucracy to give them the permissions that they want. Not all countries can do that because of how they are organized politically. But the US, Canada, Australia, at least are already on it. So you also have two different price levels for these materials, and you've seen in the last weeks and days the prices of these mining companies, Western mining companies, shooting up. And so I've studied a lot the valuation of these companies. And it's a little bit tricky because when you look at, for instance, a rare earth ETF, a substantial part of the companies outside of China are losing money, and the ones that are making money are very expensive. When people buy these ETF, apart from their now meme shares, they make the calculation that the Western governments have to give these mining companies price guarantees that incentivize them to do this kind of mining. So in summary, I think that the West has learned a lesson and will not stop building their own independence from now on.
Yeah, we can just talk a little bit about what these rare earth materials actually go into. So one of the major things is actually that they reinforce kind of magnets. They make magnets a lot more powerful, which are needed in both like EVs. They are needed in more sophisticated robots. They're to some extent needed some of these materials in chips as well. So yeah, and one place they're needed a lot would be in defense. For example, the F-35 fighter jet. I think it's for like 400 kilos of rare earth materials in one jet. So I mean, it kind of seems that there could also be a strategic bet that China would say, we want to win in the industries where we're not leading right now. So do you think that could be a possibility, saying, we'll win the AI game, the advanced robotics game, the defense technology game, and simply restrict these materials to an extent where it will delay the West and the US significantly?
I think that can be kind of the calculation, and it completely mirrors what the US is doing on the access to NVIDIA chips, where they said China cannot buy in any of the best chips. So they can buy maybe five steps from the best. And so China say, yeah, but we will restrict you on other things. So just to be specific, I don't think that the rare earth really plays a major role in rolling out large language models, these foundational huge models. It's more in what you call embedded intelligence or physical AI, where you have machines that have lots and lots of magnets, so autonomous robots and cars and whatnot. So they have like each other by the throat right now, and it really makes sense for both of them say that, okay, I will help you if you help me. And I would not be entirely surprised if a trade deal is good for NVIDIA and so allows NVIDIA to sell more to the Chinese market.
But do you think that the Chinese might be able to think more long-term than, for example, the US government? So, I mean, Trump, he wants to get reelected, so he doesn't want a recession, for example, or a stock market in terrible shape, right? Well, maybe Xi could afford to think 10 years ahead and say, we just want to win in the long term. So we want this trade war and we want to kind of cripple the West. Do you think there's a chance that maybe he want that, but maybe the big companies and people in business in China would not want that?
Let me just say, you said Trump wants to be reelected. We are some people who hope he doesn't want to be reelected.
yeah. At least the Republicans.
Constitutional reasons, but the US actually have elections every second year because you have the midway terms and where typically the president loses some of his majorities and becomes a sitting duck. So any American president has a short-term pressure. And especially in the US, it's like 2-year timelines. They have 2-year increments. So yes, China is capable of enduring more pain politically than any Western government is. You could say the same about Russia. They can make their populations suffer a lot. But I think the Chinese leaders are also rational, and if they can see that there's some way of having win-win, I think they will go for that. So I still believe that there's a high chance of an agreement, and we should remember that if it really gets tough, America has a lot up the sleeve. So first of all, U.S. exports to China is about half a percent of U.S. GDP. Chinese export to U.S. is 3% of GDP. If they lose that, I mean, in principle, if they entirely lose that export, it's about 20 million jobs or 15 million jobs that they lose. They've already got critically high youth unemployment. China also needs access to the American banking system. So yeah, you can live without cooperation, but it's going to be expensive for both of them.
You're just back from China yourself, promoting our book Hyperintelligence. And I'm actually really curious, what sentiment do you feel out there in terms of how they look at the US and maybe the EU does it feel like at least that we are adversaries on government level, but maybe not on business level?
I think the most significant thing I've observed is from being, so just for the context, so I've been there 3 times the last 12 months, and I've done, in my last trip, I did exactly 20 interviews. And I've been, speaking with investors, and I had, among my 20 interviews, there were 3 90-minute interviews with, for instance, the co-founder of the Shanghai and Shenzhen Stock Exchange, the #1 awarded Chinese economist, and so on. So I don't get a feel at all for the common man on the street on average in the entire enormous China feels, but I do get a feel for how these people in leadership positions feel. And in my previous trips, I also had a lot of interviews, but I was also sitting on various panels where I was the only non-Chinese. So they had simultaneous translation for me and so on. So I heard everything that was said, and where the entire audience was Chinese. So the most striking thing is that they never mention Europe. And when I say never, I really mean that in all of this time, with all of these events, nobody even once mentioned Europe. Europe is, in terms of geopolitics, economics, and technology, not an issue for China. It's a non-entity. They are very, very focused on the US, and they admire the US for its technology. I heard people talking about Elon Musk both on record and privately, with enormous admiration. So the Chinese people, they love these hardcore entrepreneurs. I got some inside stories about how Elon Musk came to China, flew to Beijing, had a meeting with the top minister, then flew out where there was a big battery factory, got a 2 hours lesson in how long time it takes to manufacture, or how complicated it is to make good batteries, and then said, I'd like to buy 2 production lines, when can you ship them, what do they cost, and so on, and then flies back the same day, kind of thing. So I also sense that they actually admire Donald Trump because he's a man of action. He gets stuff done. He's actually quite similar to the Chinese mindset, which is, let's go do things, where the European bureaucracy doesn't impress them at all. They do focus a lot on the competition between the US and China. And I got several times some questions that sort of surprised me when I got them. So the question is, which nation do you think will dominate the world 10 years from now? And it's not a question you would typically get in the West, because you would assume that there would be different hemisphere, or at least 2 dominant groups. So my answer would always be, I don't think anyone will dominate, because any country, the US and China, is a part of an ecosystem with a lot of partners. And if one gets too strong and dominant, a lot of companies will swing to the other one. So I think there will be at least 2 different dominant area or cultures or sections of the world, and perhaps with China, India coming up as a third at one point. So another thing I notice, which really strikes me, is that I do a lot of presentations for instance, for investment banks in Europe, where they have their high net worth or institutional clients, and also at technical universities and entrepreneur sessions. And in Europe, it's really male dominated. And I don't mean that it's, the men are dominating the women, but it's in some cases, for instance, in entrepreneurship, it would be typically 95% men. Let's say we have something is free, anybody can show up. 95% of the people who show up to listen to something about entrepreneurship are men. In technical discussions, the AI technology, maybe 90% are men, and so on. Super wealthy people, 80% men, at least, sometimes 90. In China, it's different. And so many of the things I did, it was more women than men talking about these things. In other time. At other times, it was perhaps 70% men, 30% women, or 60-40. There are far more women in China who take STEM education, so science, technology, engineering, and math. And I try to understand why. And the best answer I've been able to find is that it's because you make more money. And they also want to be independent of men. So they figure that if I want to be not depending on any man, of having a husband or of my husband, if I have one, I need to make money and have a strong career, and I can do that in math or engineering or something like that. So China has an advantage that people sometimes don't talk enough about, in my opinion, which is an absolutely enormous talent pool, which has an education and a training that's relevant for winning in a technology race. And one of the things that I repeated many times, which they always put into, if it was, for instance, a written article following an interview. So as I said that, as far as I can see, in the US, there are about 100,000 people working on AI professionally, full time, and about 30% of these are born in China. And if you look at the leading AI scientists in the US, about half are born in China. These numbers are really odd, aren't they? And when you come to China, you have these absolutely massive armies of people who are working on this. And China is very focused on another part of AI than the US. So if you take the leading large language models, which require these huge AI factories, some of them with massive energy consumption, and lots of the best chips in the world, at least for training. So among the leading ones, the US has 40, China has 15, and Europe has 3, which are all French, and that's it. But then if you look at what China is focused on, they're focused on something else. It's called AI Plus or AI Plus One. And this is implementation mainly of small language models and just agentic AI across the society. So they want to put a layer of intelligence across all of China. And that requires people. So it's about automating stuff, but getting it implemented in different specific situations in the commercial environment requires a lot of people who understand AI and who are capable of understanding how do we automate this. So China is very, very strong on these technologies, and they don't require the best chips. But they would love to have access to the best NVIDIA chips for training purposes. Once you've trained an LLM or a small language model, the inference doesn't require the best chips. And so they're fine with inference. It's just for the training that they would like to have the NVIDIA chips.
Do you think it's important for these, you would call them businessmen or elites in China, that China becomes number one across the board when it comes to these advanced industries, when it comes to having the largest maybe GDP, when it comes to having the most powerful defense, etc.?
The fact that somebody asked me about who will be the leading dominating nation in the world indicates that it's on somebody's mind. But having said that, I think most Chinese people in many ways think like most Western people, in the sense that they just want to be successful, they want to be wealthy, they are acutely aware that their population and workforce has entered decline, and that decline can be quite massive, so they have to automate. I got about 200 questions in total during all my interviews. And then what happens when you was on such a roadshow is that you see what people respond to, what they're interested in, where they have follow-up questions. And one of the things where they very often had follow-up questions was when I said that it can very well be that in the long term it's an advantage for a country to have few people, but a lot of technology. And then I took some examples from history where very, very small city-states have been incredibly powerful. I mentioned the situation in the Middle East now, where Israel militarily has been attacked and attacked, for 50 years by much, much more populated nations, but have won every single war, and now completely is sitting like the dominant military nation in spite of it being tiny, because they are superior in technology. They catch up on that really, really strongly, and they actually asked me to write an article, which I did for China Daily, which is the mouthpiece of Xi about this. So they are buying into that we need to be very, very strong on technology, and we cannot change that our population is declining, and perhaps it's even a good thing.
So let's talk a little bit about how the investor should look at this. So obviously we saw a big decline on the stock market, and then after Trump said everything is going to be fine, it pretty much climbed back. At least it clawed back like I think 60% of the decline. So what's your take? Do you agree with his assessment that it will be fine in the short and the long term?
So my bet is, but geopolitics is really really difficult to predict. But my bet is that they will do this deal. They will announce a deal on the 29th, and it will be quite constructive, and it will be better for China than many people estimate. And I have a follow-up bet. So if this is true, then I think the Chinese stock market will do extremely well for a while. And the reason I think that is, well, it's a couple of things. The first thing is that the Chinese consumers have a ton of money on their bank accounts. It reached up to almost 2 times the market cap of the listed stock markets. Last time that happened, I think it was 2014. All this savings that the Chinese had started rotating into the stock market. So the savings went down, stock market went up like a rocket, almost tripled. And then the second thing, if you look at the Chinese investor, is that there's this expression you once used for Margaret Thatcher, Tina, there is no alternative. And so if you look at what can they invest in, so the property market is overbuilt. Doesn't look like a good investment for perhaps another 5 years. I mean, it's not a good investment perhaps for the next 5 years. And it's been a really bad investment for the last 4 years. They can put the money on a bank account, then you get 1.1% or 1.2%. You can have them in government T-bonds, then you get maybe 1.7, 1.8%. If you invest in equities, you have an earnings yield which is close to 6%. You have a dividend yield which is perhaps 2.3%. So if you look at statistics for stock markets around the world, if you have a dividend yield from equities which is higher than the bond yield, that's normally a very good idea to invest in the equities. And second, if the difference between the bond yield and the earnings yield on equities is as high as it is, which is more than 4%, it also tends to be a very good idea to invest and in equities. And then in addition to this, there are a couple of things that I like strategically. First of all, something I've shown a lot in China, which is a plot of where different countries are positioned in ranking on Global Innovation Index versus the GDP per capita. And there's a very high correlation. So the richest country in the world is Switzerland, where I am right now. And that's also number one on Global Innovation Index. And then it trends all the way down. So there are a few outliers. India is more innovative compared to its GDP per capita than it should be. So that bodes well for India. Vietnam even more, but most of all, among anybody, China just surpassed Germany. So it is more innovative than Germany. But this is per capita. So if you then multiply by number of people, is hugely innovative. But if you put China on where it should be in GDP per capita based on where it is on innovation, it should be like 3 or 4 times as wealthy as it is now. So I think there's, because of their huge innovation, a very strong long-term case for Chinese growth. There are a number of reasons that I think that if this is sorted out in a way where there's clarity and clarity at a level that China can live with, then I think the Chinese equities could rise a lot. I know, these kind of predictions always, you cannot be sure, but that's my best guess is that this will happen.
I'm guessing that's also a bull case for US stock.
Yeah, I would think so. And by the way, I mean, we've seen so many deals announced since Liberation Day on April 2nd. And I've looked at all the stock markets in the countries that have done the deals with the US. They've done one out of two things, either nothing or gone up a lot. I can't recall anybody that have tanked after they did a deal with the US, even though every deal has put these countries in a worse position than they had before. Also from that perspective, just to get certainty is great for China. And we should also note that China has already demonstrated enormous resilience. So while they've been negotiating, China has been subject to very high tariffs. But they've still managed to increase their export year to date, or is it 12 months, last 12 months, but I think it's year to date by 6.5%. They managed to just export more to other countries. So they're not, I mean, they just show strengths in innovation and strengths in exports. So internally, they have some structural problems, mainly in the property market, but they also have a lot of strength.
I was thinking, how much do China think about BRICS? Because when I talk to my different colleagues in Brazil or India or Russia, they're all pretty keen on BRICS, even kind of other countries who are not yet 100% part of it, like Saudi Arabia seems very keen. And when I then confront them with the question, saying, well, but you have nothing in common, then they would kind of respond, well, we have the thing in common that we want to take power away from the West, and that is a strong enough common denominator. How about China? Are they excited about BRICS, or don't they think about it at all?
I have not heard it mentioned a single time. I don't think it matters to them, and I don't think BRICS matters much in general. As you said, they have nothing in common, and now you mentioned Saudi. So there's been a process since the first Trump period where you had Abraham Accords negotiated mainly by Kushner, and you have seen massive shift in the geopolitics of the Middle East, so that a number of nations, most notably the Gulf nations, are now firmly in the US camp. And you saw that recently when Trump went on, escorted by a number of the most prominent business leaders in the US, that he went to Saudi, Qatar, and Emirates, did massive cooperation deals, and where there's AI and there's American weapons and there's cross investments and huge amounts involved, and where now almost every nation except Iran is sort of accepting or even backing Israel. So Saudi is part of BRICS, but Saudi is firmly in the Western camp, in my opinion.
It's interesting. I think recently it has seemed like India is moving closer to China and further away from the US, at least watching the news. How is that relationship between India and China forming? How interested are China in India and that collaboration?
Well, so India is what you call a swing state in global geopolitics. And I read a very interesting analysis by a company called Alpine Macro about the strengths and weaknesses of being a swing state. And so they take different nations that act like India in the sense that they never commit clearly whether they are on the Chinese side or on the Western side, because this is what it's about right now. And they argued very convincingly, in my opinion, that it's not a good idea to be a swing state. And that is because nobody wants to really make long-term commitment with somebody who doesn't commit back. And that's why, so the Middle East, the Arab nations that are now firmly in the Western camp, they're getting very strong commitments because they are no longer considered swing states or even hostile. So there's something called safe compute zones. So a safe compute zone is a place where you think they're so reliable that you're willing to put technology in to make AI factories, because you think they will not try to steal the technology and they will not try to sell the services to what you consider hostile actors. But you do not do that with somebody who flips flops. And so in many different ways, it doesn't pay in the long term to be a swing state. And it's certainly a possibility that India at one point chooses a direction. And I cannot say which direction that would be. Nor can I say for sure whether it will happen. I do think, though, that they are most likely to swing Western, but let's see.
And how welcome do you think they would be to swing China's way? I mean, because there's been historic hostility between the two countries. Would China be interested and willing to partner closely with India?
Yeah, of course. India is a huge market, growing very fast. So anybody who gets a close alliance with India has a massive gain from that. I think that what China has now is built a very, very strong relationship with Russia being the clear underdog. By doing that, China makes it perhaps more difficult to get strong relations with some other nations. So Donald Trump is a very, very big risk taker in these matters. And when he says that India will have to pay another 50% tariff because they import Russian oil, he's kind of gambling with the relationship between the US and India. But I have to say, I follow Modi on X, and Modi on X sends a lot of messages out where he's really, really pleasing Donald Trump. So right now, I think whatever hostility and friction there might be is super easy to repair.
Okay, so right now we've talked most about if this rare earth gamble will be resolved. What if it goes the other way? Like, how big do you think the risk is that that either Xi and Trump will not meet in Korea, or that no deal will be made, so that kind of the stance hardens, the US put more and more tariffs on China, and China would restrict the rare earth materials more and more. How likely is that scenario?
I think it's very unlikely, but I also think it would be very bad if it happens. One of the reasons I think it's very unlikely is that the people who are involved on both sides are highly competent. And it's not common that highly competent people make a win-lose or lose-lose scenario, as it would be a lose-lose scenario. So that's why I think it's very likely that there will be a constructive agreement. Let's say if China would seriously cut off access to rare earth, then the West would have no alternative than to seriously restrict Chinese exports and Chinese access to critical Western technology. And it would have significant impact on global economic performance until, I think, in the end, it would get resolved anyway.
But who do you think holds the upper hand here? If China said, well, we have a 10-year plan, let's call it China 2035, do you think they would be, could endure simply having this cold trade war? Could say, well, the long-term benefit of leading in advanced robotics, leading so much in maybe something like EVs, for example, and even maybe overtaking the US on some of the more advanced weapons. I mean, do you think that could be, at least for maybe Xi, be kind of a goal rather than kind of short-term relief?
I really don't think so. It's very difficult to estimate the total damage that a full out non-kinetic lose-lose scenario would lead to. However, I can recall that I saw on Bloomberg an estimate of what would be the impact of China with a kinetic war between China and Taiwan. No, mainland China and island China, as they also sometimes call it. But the calculation, which is of course just one estimate, was that the Chinese GDP would drop 16%. China has a lot of on stake, and if you have such a situation, then I think it can be super risky. I don't think China they're actually not known for being big risk takers. China has a very, very long tradition for not attacking nations, or for trying to seek, in the end, diplomatic solutions. So it would be very bad, but it's very, very unlikely.
So if you should put a percent on that, is it less than 10%?
A percentage on a continued escalating hostility, I think it's less than 5%.
I mean, I would kind of think that if you look at these rare earth materials, they have actually been limited in 3 phases. The first one was in 2023, when some export restrictions were put on some of these rare earth materials, not the most important ones. Then in April 2025, it was actually then that China put the restrictions on some of the most important rare earth materials. But so they put the restrictions on the materials, but not the refining of the materials. And what they're doing now is that they are kind of tightening the screw with the refining. How realistic would it then be that all this could be walked back? I mean, both the tariffs on China, but also the restrictions on rare earth materials that has been kind of been increasing for the last 2 years.
Well, the point of an agreement is to completely remove these kind of things, but I think China would demand access to better chips from the West. Giving them that would be a big, not that easy to sell politically, because in the US, people would say, hey, this is our strategic security that you just traded away. It can certainly happen. And of course, there are degrees of these things. But I think you don't want to make an agreement where you are still harassing each other if you can avoid it.
So what do you think will actually happen to the prices of the rare earth materials? So if we imagine that this is getting resolved, at least to some extent, do you then think the rare earth materials would fall in price?
No, because I think the West, no matter what, will subsidize production of rare earth materials so that within the next 5 to 10 years, they're completely independent on non-Western suppliers. So I actually think you will have guaranteed prices for 10 years or something like that, so that the mining companies can go all in on doing this. It's a similar, let me say, it's similar to what you've seen with implementation of solar and wind in many places in Europe, for instance, where you say, you can safely deploy this because we guarantee you some, floor on the price.
So it's part of the strategy that the US would want people to kind of buy the rare earth material ETF to get more funding to start refining these materials. I mean, is that a way to invest in it?
It certainly helps, yeah. And it certainly helps when the stock prices of these mining companies go up. If they go up on a sustainable basis, which is that they have a guaranteed profitable output for their produce.
I mean, what would be your own strategy? Investing in the mining companies or investing in an ETF following the price of the materials, or would it basically have the same outcome?
So because of how much they've gone up, I'm not. So I have exposure to this, but it's not something I would go headless into with a huge amount at these levels. I think an ETF with a mining companies is where you have the upside still. I think some of the upside that I could imagine that we'll see from here will be of a meme nature. So it will just be retail investors who are reading about this conflict, and then they say, "Oh, you can buy an ETF with rare earth," without checking the aggregate forward PE of the companies they're investing in. So as just for comparison, for instance, I think you can also buy ETFs based on uranium miners, and I think they are on, fundamentally, economically, they are on a more solid footing, because there's actually going to be, and there's now, a real shortage of uranium compared to what is needed. So it's not so politically driven. It's actually driven by some sounder fundamentals.
Let's talk a little bit about kind of the future of AI and robotics, maybe seen a little bit more from the Chinese side. So as I see it, the whole talk of AGI has died a little bit down in the West. Well, first of all, because it's very hard to define what it means. And second of all, because people like Sam Altman, on the interview with, for example, Tucker Carlson, he kind of said, yes, AI will replace workers, but at a historic, the average rate. Maybe it will be concentrated in a shorter term now, but then we'll just kind of fall back to the historic rate of displacement and automation, which doesn't sound bullish at all. And then at the same time, we got ChatGPT 5, which I think, is great, but it's maybe not that AGI moment that some people had expected. What's your own take, and what do you think? I mean, how are the Chinese viewing this? Do they think we are on kind of the fast train to AGI land?
The Chinese are absolute maximum bullies on AI. I can tell you that they are all over it, and they actually gave me the annual AGI Development Award, even though I'm not an AI coder, simply because, well, first of all, I'm founder of the company Supertrends, which uses agentic AI to predict the future, including the future of AI. But because I'm articulate about the consequences for society and lifestyle and general economics and so on of AI. They believe that it's absolutely vital for China to be very, very good at implementing AI across the society. I don't think they care much about artificial general intelligence as a milestone. They care about rolling it out, putting it into every work process in every bank, insurance company, media company, you name it, and use that in order to drive up unit labor productivity continuously, year after year, decade after decade in China, and stage after stage. So right now it's about AI sitting on computers, some of it in huge data parks, or AI factories, but most of it on smaller computers, not even servers, in companies, in organizations, just relentlessly driving up productivity. And then beginning mainly from about 3 years from now, the massive large-scale rollout of AI-powered versatile robots, including humanoid robots. And so they are on the forefront of making these robots. And then of course, you have self-driven cars. And this is very popular in China, and it's popular at different places in the US, and there will hopefully soon also be a lot of them in Europe. But they also believe that a lot. So the short answer to your question about whether they find AI important is they talk about nothing else.
And do you think kind of a new maybe AGI definition is emerging, or that we can talk about it in a different way. Personally, I'm starting to analyze how much work AI can do from a prompt and how much you can automate. So, for example, today, for most people, I would still call AI the co-pilot for a small company. Like you could say, how do I make a small consultancy company on, let's say, digital marketing? AI will not run your company yet. At least that takes some very complex agentic AI to do it. But I'm thinking in 5 years, we'll be at a stage where you can move from actually doing the stuff to becoming maybe the board of directors of a company that's being run by agentic AI. Do you think that is more the way that the Chinese are looking at this now?
Yeah. So first of all, when I've been around giving examples, for instance, at universities, one of the examples I give is our own company, because it's I know exactly how it works. And we have agentic AI doing the work of about that would require 500 analysts and journalists, speaking 40 different languages, by the way. So this is done completely automatic by agentic AI, and people are really fascinating by such things. So one of the things that I've discussed a lot at these presentations and dialogues is that since the beginning or since the end of 2024, we got the reasoners. So these are these AI models like the OpenAI o1, o3, DeepSeek also in China, which work more like an academic. So it's not, if you give them calculation example, it's not like 7 times 19 is what I feel. It actually gives you the exact number, so it activates a real calculator that never makes mistakes. So the reasoners has been with us now for close to a year, and where they are most successful right now, or making most impact, is in coding. And today you see sometimes when you put reasoners at really complex coding tasks that they can run for something like 20 minutes, non-stop, efficiently, just executing or solving a problem. And perhaps in 20 minutes, they do the work that would require a good coder 2 years. But these 20 minutes are getting longer and longer, and it's a little bit hyper exponential. So you roll it forward, it looks like by 2028, so 3 years from now, they can run perpetually. It's a situation that's kind of similar to what we see with nuclear fusion reactors, where they can run for a while and then they shut down, and they're getting that longer and longer. And they're thinking also there that in about 3 years, they can run perpetually. So we have these two technologies on a very exciting path. But when they can run perpetually, then you have the precondition for, as you said, having a CEO and AI as a CEO, although that's not really the example I would give. But I would focus on the example that some smart people, they design a company that can run completely autonomously. And this is what we call a DAO, Digital Automated Organization. And we already have one amongst us, which is among us, and that's Bitcoin. But Bitcoin is not based on AI. But with Bitcoin, we show how enormously successful an organization with no management can be. And we will begin probably from around 2028 really to see some of these roll out. And that's where people talk about single founder or dual founder unicorns, where it's simply some people who unleash an incredibly successful, completely automated, automatically evolving AI system. And I think these things are far more important than the discussion about artificial general intelligence, because none of these models need to have the combination of intelligence that humans have. They just have to have a combination of intelligence that enable them to create something truly amazing that doesn't exist today.
If you listen to Sam Altman, for example, he's definitely talking down the proposition of AI being too powerful and able to automate too many things. I think he's made a shift. Do you think Is that more of a political shift because he does not want regulation? Or do you think there are other reasons for this? I mean, it's definitely, if he's saying that the automation will go back to the historic average, that would mean diminishing returns from robotics and AI. Do you think he believes that?
I actually I cannot answer that. I don't know that. But what I do think is that it's very important to focus on what will people do in a world where you both have AI sitting on computers and then physical AI robots and auto driving cars and so on, doing smart things and which will replace a lot of jobs. And this is one of the things I've spoken a lot about in China. So in total, on my last trip, I was in interviews or giving speeches 28 hours. So I I heard I got a very very good sense of what they're interested in, and of course they're very interested in what will humans do. And when I were in these dialogues, it was not just me talking. I mean, people were talking to me, and I heard a lot of things, and it kind of crystallized more in my mind as I was there. Um, uh, Especially at one point, I was speaking at a private club, so I was out at different private clubs, investment communities, but also something called the Residence, which is by Harris. You know, the Harrods, the famous British magazine. Um, and I thought that making clubs is one of the things that humans will do in more of in the future. So actually, I've been looking into the market for clubs, and it's growing about 7% a year, compounding globally about 7% a year. So it's really really hot market, and I see that everywhere. So for instance, I was co-founder in a very humble way some years ago of a club in the ski resort called Verbier. And I was kind of skeptical, it was just a restaurant up in the mountain. And I thought, who wants to be a member of this? There are lots of restaurants. And it was completely sold out, all memberships in a few weeks. And there's been a waiting list ever since. And I just see then came another club, and I think there are more on the way. Interaction with other humans have a value that will not go away, no matter how smart AI and robots are. So one example is that I think that education will change nature, but it will not. It will still be a social thing. So much of the learning, just getting stuff into your brain, will be done very very efficient by AI, partly personalized AI. Um, but if I want to, let's say, I'd like to be a watchmaker, a Swiss watchmaker. Okay, AI could teach me everything about the mechanics of making a watch. But if I meet other people who also want to be or are Swiss watchmakers, then it builds my identity. It motivates me, and the same. I do fitness training, and if I do it with a trainer, I train much harder. And I'm supposed to, when the trainer is not there, to do exactly the same. But I'm not so sweaty when the trainer is not there. So people motivate each other, build the identity for each other. And I know quite a lot of business consultants who said that in a way, their life got a lot easier during COVID lockdowns because they could do the consulting online without having to travel. But they also noted that the things that were agreed were in many cases not implemented. But if you were present physically with people, it is much more likely to get implemented. We need to be very conscious about these transitions, and I think that Sam Altman, when he talks about that it'll be okay, I think he does understand. He's fully aware that humans in the past have been incredibly good at just creating new jobs or changing the way we cooperate, and we will continue to be good at that. He's probably also aware of that in some cases, while some parts of the society implement new technologies incredibly fast, others do it less so. But in my own perspective, the unit labor productivity of AI in both its physical and non-physical form will be substantial. So unit labor productivity in the US, for instance, over the last 30, 40 years has been trending with the growth rates between 1% and 3%. And quite recently, we were down close to about 1%. It's now trending up. And many predict that will go up to around 3%. Some say much higher. I mean, the highest I've heard is 30%. I don't believe that at all, but I do believe that it might go over 3%, perhaps up in 4 or 5% a year, or something like that. So I think we are entering a period with extremely high economic growth. Some of that growth will not be captured well by the way we measure GDP per capita, but nevertheless growth, and at the same time low inflation. So a very interesting investment environment, I think, is ahead.
So Supertrends makes predictions all the time. You have these timelines. When you have to adjust these predictions, do you see a trend in some predictions where you become less bullish, and other predictions where you become more bullish and you think they'll happen sooner?
Well, there have been some disappointments. For instance, nanotechnology has been a huge disappointment. I I have to say I was skeptical from the start. I think there are also disappointments in the pipeline. I think, for instance, if you look at ARC Innovation, they talk about the main technologies driving accelerated growth in the world economy, and then they include blockchain. And I find it really hard to see how blockchain can be a very big driver of economic growth. But I find it super, super easy to see how AI and the consequences of AI can do it. So what we have seen, and this we can see it in Supertrends timeline, but we can also it's well documented, so we can see it from many other sources, is that predictions about AI have persistently been way, way too conservative. And you can actually, if you, there's been a period where the predictions for when we would have AGI have been moving 15 years forward per year. And that's such an enormous miscalculation by the consensus. So I would firmly be on the optimistic side in terms of how quickly AI will evolve. It's an incredibly scaling friendly technology, and technology which already is beginning to become recursive. So you and I are two of the three co-authors of the book Hyperintelligence, which was the reason that I meant that many of the Chinese interviews I did were made. And some people ask about what is hyperintelligence, because sometimes people use the term superintelligence. And the way I explain it is that superintelligence is where AI, on most, if not necessarily every single aspect, but on most aspects, it beats humans vastly in its capability. And I say, in my opinion, we are very close to that. The large LLMs, they already beat most PhDs in very, very demanding questions within their own field of expertise. In terms, if you take IQ tests, they are getting pretty close to 160 and 180. So I don't think I've ever met a person who has an IQ of 180, and so on. But then when it becomes recursive, so it starts recoding itself faster and faster, then it just blasts into this completely new domain, which is hyperintelligence, where it starts solving questions that no humans collectively have been able to find solutions to, and begins to ask questions that nobody have asked because they didn't know that was interesting. And I don't think that's very far in the future. So my predictions, all these definitions are fluffy, right? But But as I describe it, I think we are heading into super intelligence like right now, and at least within the next 2 years, and that hyper intelligence will follow surprisingly quickly after.
But I also think at the same time, people or many people are quite unimpressed in general. I mean, they're like, yeah, but I expected ChatGPT to be more than it is, and it's still making mistakes. All these things kind of talking down the efficiency of AI, saying it's a bubble. What do you think chances are that we stand in 2029 when many people say we'll have AGI, whatever that means? And we'll say, yeah, but it's still not all that. It still can't run a company by itself, or it would still make mistakes. Because, I mean, I think that the human expectations, they evolve so quickly. So we always kind of expect more. Do you think that might be the case when we look 4 years ahead?
Well, I'm sure some people will say that, but I don't think it will be true. So if people complain about the performance of AI, it's a little bit like I was so amazed when you could suddenly be online when you were on an airplane. So they built this little thing on top, and which is quite amazing technology. I know because I was actually invested in one of the leading companies doing this. But it didn't take long because people started saying, "Why is it so slow?" and so the expectations run amok. So I think many of the people who are disappointed by the stage of AI right now are disappointed because they're not good at prompting. And so, of course, the system should help them avoid that issue by understanding just what you say vocally, and then in a normal forth and back dialogue, get to the point of what you want to achieve, and then prompt itself and deliver it, which it can do now, but it can become ever better at that. And I think that would be one of the many, many big shifts there will be in the society, is that to date it's been a very big task for many humans to learn to understand technology. But as technology evolves in the way I just described, it becomes a much bigger task for technology to understand people, because we don't need to understand this technology at all. We don't even need to know how to make a good prompt. We just need to be able to talk with it. So it will try very, very hard to figure out what it is we do, what it is we want. So another shift is the one I alluded to in education, where you will get what you call the inverted classroom, that instead of a teacher talking to people and then giving them homework, it will be AI that teach people where they are not at the physical institution. And then when they are at the physical institution, they jointly try to solve a problem based on what they have learned at home. So that inverts the learning process. And so there will be so many things that swap around, but they don't disappear. It's just the nature of how they work will swap around.
Interesting. So I think we have so much more to talk about, but let's do that next time. But it's really interesting to hear that you don't feel that there are any diminishing returns in the AI development at the moment. Thank you for coming, Lars.
It was a pleasure, as always.
See you soon.